The smoke rolled low over the shattered remnants of Königsberg, blending with the thick morning fog as artillery echoes faded into silence. In the stillness that followed, an old man with a crooked back and a rusted rifle stood beside a teenage boy too thin for his wool coat. They were not soldiers in any traditional sense, but they wore armbands marked Volkssturm and uniforms patched together from old stockpiles and civilian coats. They were what remained. They were the last defenders of a regime unraveling from within. Hans Weber, once a professor of classical philosophy, now led a unit of these makeshift soldiers. His classroom had been bombed months ago, and the university library burned to the ground. When the call came to defend the fatherland, he did not volunteer out of loyalty to Hitler. He did so because there was nothing left. His son had died in Stalingrad, his wife in a British air raid on Dresden. All that remained was duty, even if it meant standing with boys and pensioners against Soviet tanks. Among his unit was Dieter, a boy of barely 16 with pale eyes and a jaw clenched too tightly for his age. Dieter had once recited Hitler Youth chants with pride, but the war had stolen the certainty from his voice. His older brother had vanished on the Eastern Front, and no letters came anymore. Their mother had sewn his Volkssturm insignia by candlelight and told him, "Be brave. Protect our people." She had cried afterward, thinking he wouldn't hear. Hans watched Dieter as they waited in silence behind a crumbling stone wall, one of the few remaining structures in their sector. The Red Army was close now. Hans could feel the earth tremble under the advance. There was no illusion of victory among the men, only the dull obligation to hold one more day, perhaps only one more hour. In hushed tones, he gave orders to retreat to the secondary line if the tanks came. He did not mention that there was no real secondary line. 2 houses down, Erika Brandt stitched bandages from torn curtains. She had once been a midwife, now drafted to treat wounds she had no training for. Her son had been taken into the SS in 1944, and she hadn't heard from him since. She avoided asking questions. In war, silence often protected more than truth. Erika's hands trembled as she tied a bandage around the leg of a wounded man moaning from blood loss. She offered no reassurances, only a touch to his shoulder before she moved on. As night fell, an eerie quiet descended. Fires glowed in the distance, casting shadows on broken walls and skeletal trees. Inside the makeshift command post, a half-collapsed butcher's shop, Hans unfolded a map no longer accurate, marking positions with charcoal. "If they break through at the bridge," he said to a young postman who now carried messages instead of letters, "we fall back to the train yard. There's no other route." The postman nodded, though he barely understood. He was 19 and had never fired a gun until last week. The next morning, the Red Army attacked. It started with mortars. The blasts tore apart the fog and the last illusions of calm. Dieter's squad huddled behind sandbags stacked with broken cobblestones. A shell landed too close, flinging one of the boys backward into a wall, his cry lost in the explosion. Dieter didn't scream. He aimed his rifle with shaky hands, firing blindly into the smoke. Hans barked orders, voice hoarse but steady, guiding what he could, commanding what remained. By noon, the front had buckled. Hans was hit, shrapnel to the side. He refused evacuation, if such a word still meant anything. Erika found him behind a trolley car, pressing his coat to the wound. "You're no good to them dead," she said. "I'm no good to them alive either," he replied, and then, seeing her face, added, "But I'll hold." In the chaos, Dieter found himself alone, separated from the others. The street was a hellscape, burning carts, shattered glass, the stink of cordite and blood. A Soviet tank rolled slowly into view, its gun swiveling with casual menace. Dieter ducked into a shop front and waited, heart hammering, fingers frozen around the rifle's stock. He wanted to run. He wanted to scream for his mother, but he didn't. He held his ground, and for reasons he'd never understand, the tank passed him by. That evening, Hans's voice cracked as he called the few survivors to the train yard. Of 40 in the unit, only 12 could still walk. The rest were gone or left behind. Erica helped the wounded drag themselves through rubble. Dieter limped with a burn on his arm and dirt in his hair. They reached the yard by twilight, trains long since looted or destroyed. There was no real shelter, only the steel shells of old freight cars. Hans gathered them in the shadows of the boxcars and looked at their faces, so young, so weary. "Tomorrow," he said, "we will be attacked again. I cannot order you to stay. There is no punishment left to give. If you choose to go, I will not stop you. If you choose to fight, stand beside me." No one spoke. The silence was heavy, but not empty. In it lived every scream, every sacrifice, every moment that had brought them here. Dieter stood straighter. Erica nodded once. One by one, the others followed. Hans sat down on the edge of a wooden crate, pulling his coat tighter against the wind. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "we'll hold again." Just one more day. Above them, the stars flickered dimly through drifting smoke. The war would not end that night, but neither would their resolve. Somewhere beyond the eastern horizon, Soviet artillery was already being prepared. But for now, the last ditch stood, bloodied but unbroken, waiting for dawn. The wind scoured the empty train yard as snow began to fall in dry, whispering sheets, covering the soot-blackened ground with a thin white veneer. It was a cruel illusion of peace. In the shadow of derailed freight cars, the remnants of Hans Weber's unit crouched by oil drum fires, their faces drawn, silent, marked by the weight of choices made under artillery skies. They had held for another day, just as Hans had asked. Now they waited, wondering if that day had meant anything. Dieter sat with his back against a rusting axle, clutching his rifle like a talisman. His burn had blistered beneath the bandage Erica had wrapped in haste, but he said nothing. Pain was just another fact of existence. He had begun to realize that war wasn't thunder and glory. It was silence, hunger, and waiting. Across from him, a man they called Schmidt, a former tailor from Leipzig, smoked a hand-rolled cigarette with trembling fingers. "They'll come again," Schmidt muttered. Not to anyone in particular. "They always do." Hans moved among them, slower now, leaning heavily on a stick he'd fashioned from a broken fence post. His wound seeped beneath the dressing, but he didn't speak of it. Pain was a distraction, and he had no time for it. What mattered was keeping his unit together. The train yard offered little cover and no escape, but retreat was unthinkable. There was nowhere left to go. Near the back of the yard, Erica organized what passed for a medical station. Blankets on cold ground, tin basins filled with melted snow, a few dwindling vials of morphine. She worked methodically, refusing despair even as her supplies dwindled. "If we're to die," she told Hans earlier, "let us at least die like human beings." He had nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of a shared truth. That evening, a runner arrived, barely more than a boy, wild-eyed and panting, carrying orders from a general whose name Hans did not recognize. The message was simple: hold the bridge east of the station. Reinforcements were not coming. Air support was not available. Supplies would not arrive. But the position must not fall. Hans read it twice, then crumpled the paper in his fist. He didn't need to show it to the others. They already knew. The bridge was a stone span, narrow and half-collapsed, but it was the only way into the city from that quadrant. Losing it would mean exposing thousands of refugees and what remained of the command post. Holding it meant sending his already fractured unit into another bloodletting. Still, at dawn, they moved. The approach to the bridge was a ruined boulevard choked with rubble and abandoned vehicles. Hans led them along a side alley, hoping to avoid snipers. Dieter stayed near the front, alert. his youth now tempered by instinct and trauma. He saw movement in a shattered storefront and raised his rifle, only to lower it when an old woman emerged, carrying a bundle of kindling. She looked at them without fear, only fatigue. They passed without a word. At the bridge, they dug in. Erica and two others dragged planks to create makeshift barricades. Schmidt set up a machine gun atop a wrecked ambulance. Dieter took position near the arch, watching for shadows among the ruins. Hours passed. Tension gnawed at their nerves like rats beneath floorboards. The first Soviet probe came shortly after noon, infantry, cautious, probing. Hans held fire until they were within range, then gave the order. Muzzle flashes lit the gloom like strobe lights. Dieter fired until his magazine clicked empty, then reloaded with numb hands. The Soviets retreated, leaving two bodies in the snow. There was no cheer, only a grim tightening of resolve. They would come again, and soon. When night fell, the wind howled like wolves through the broken windows. Dieter could not sleep. He watched the stars again, remembering the night before. Hans joined him, settling beside him with a groan. "You fought well," he said quietly. Dieter didn't answer. Praise felt hollow now. "I used to think," Hans continued after a moment, "that war revealed truth, that in suffering we might find clarity. But now, I think it just strips away everything until nothing is left but choice." "What choice?" Dieter asked. Hans looked at him. "To remain human, even here. Especially here." They sat in silence, listening to the distant crump of artillery. By morning, the Soviets returned, not in a probing line, but with force. Tanks rolled ahead of foot soldiers, guns roaring. The earth shook. The defenders opened fire with everything they had. Erica moved between positions, dragging the wounded, whispering encouragement, administering morphine to those beyond saving. Schmidt's machine gun jammed. He cursed, then pulled his pistol and kept firing. Dieter emptied his rifle, grabbed another, and kept going. Then Hans fell. A sniper's bullet, precise and unforgiving, caught him just above the collarbone. He collapsed without a sound. Erica reached him too late. He was bleeding fast, too fast. His eyes found Dieter's as he struggled for breath. "Hold," he rasped. "You must hold." Then the light faded. Dieter stood over him, frozen. For a moment the world narrowed to the space between breaths, between memory and rage. Then something changed in him, not a scream, not defiance, but a kind of cold resolve. He picked up Hans's rifle and returned to the line. They held the bridge. Somehow, impossibly, they held. When the Soviets finally withdrew at dusk, they left their dead strewn across the approach. The defenders, those who remained, stood in the smoke, trembling, bleeding, too exhausted to celebrate. Erica moved like a ghost, checking pulses, closing eyes. Schmidt lit another cigarette, hands black with soot and blood. Dieter stood at the arch, staring at the empty road beyond. He was no longer a boy. The war had taken that from him. But in his silence, in the way he held the rifle now, there was something else, something unbroken. The wind howled again, and the snow fell heavier. The bridge was theirs, for now. But the night was long, and the war was not yet done. By the third week of April, Berlin had begun to collapse inward like a burning star. The Volkssturm units, already frayed, already bled nearly dry, were now more rumor than regiment. Word arrived sporadically and often too late. Entire sectors lost. SS officers deserting their posts, Hitler sealed in a bunker beneath the Reich chancellery, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed. Still, at the edge of the Eastern District, the remnants of Hans Weber's command stood watch, now under the silent leadership of Dieter. No one had named him leader. No orders had been passed. But after Hans fell at the bridge, something shifted. The others looked to him, not because he knew more, but because he had endured. In Dieter's quiet, there was gravity. He never raised his voice, never pretended hope, but he stood when others sank. That was enough. The group had dwindled to 9. Erica remained, gaunt and gray-eyed, tending wounds with hands that never stopped shaking. Schmidt, his voice now permanently hoarse, operated what was left of their radio, a scavenged Wehrmacht set powered by a failing battery. Occasionally, it sputtered static, offering fragments of commands or distant gunfire. Once it crackled a warning. Soviet units had broken through the city's northern edge. There was no suggestion of reinforcements. Only a single word repeated twice. Resist! Resist! They were stationed now in a gutted schoolhouse turned last redoubt, its chalkboards scorched, its windows shattered. Children's drawings still clung to the walls in some places, faded and curled at the corners. In a second-floor classroom, Dieter sat on the edge of a broken desk, cleaning his rifle. It was muscle memory by now. He rarely slept. From the window, he could see the glow of fires crawling closer, devouring rooftops and swallowing streets in orange tongues. The Soviets were coming in waves, tightening the noose with brutal efficiency. That afternoon, Erica found Dieter staring at a faded map of Berlin that hung crookedly on the classroom wall. She handed him a cup of hot water flavored faintly with dried herbs and said, "It won't end here. Even if we fall, it won't end." He nodded but didn't respond. She looked at him longer. "You remind me of Hans." Dieter shook his head. "Hans was a man. I'm just... what's left. You're leading them. Only because no one else is standing." "Sometimes," she said, "that's all leadership is." Outside, a rumble announced the approach of armor. The defenders sprang into position. Dieter ordered the sandbags reinforced and the Molotovs prepared. They had no anti-tank weapons, only 2 grenades and courage worn to its threads. When the first tank appeared, its turret sweeping side to side like a predator, they waited. Dieter let it come closer than seemed wise. He timed the throw himself, flinging a bottle of flaming fuel against its treads. The fire exploded beneath it, slowing its advance. From the second floor, Schmidt dropped a grenade through the open hatch. The explosion rocked the schoolhouse. Screams followed, then silence. But the tank didn't move again. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to breathe. Erica tended to a young man with shrapnel in his thigh, whispering to calm him as she stitched. Schmidt rewound the radio coil, hoping for word, any word. Dieter moved through the rooms like a ghost, checking on his people, saying little. His hands were black with soot, his knuckles split. By nightfall, a new threat emerged. Deserters, German soldiers fleeing the front, armed and starving, dangerous in their desperation. One approached the schoolhouse under a white cloth asking for shelter. He was barely 20 but carried a submachine gun and wore the insignia of the Waffen-SS. Dieter didn't lower his weapon. "We don't shoot Germans," the boy pleaded. Dieter looked at Erica. "We don't kill unless we have to," she said quietly. Dieter nodded once. "Then don't give me a reason." The boy was disarmed and given a bedroll in the corner of the gymnasium. That night he cried in his sleep. No one woke him. The following morning, Berlin cracked, not from a single blow, but from the cumulative weight of days spent dying. The radio hissed a final broadcast. The Reich was finished. Unconditional surrender loomed. In the distance, artillery thundered like a closing door. Above the city, crows circled in the smoke. Erica found Dieter on the roof, watching the horizon. "It's over," she said softly. He didn't respond. "We've done enough." He looked at her then. "Have we?" She stepped closer. "Hans would say yes." They stood there, 2 silhouettes against a broken sky, neither weeping, neither speaking further. Below, Schmidt started dismantling the radio. Others began packing what they could carry. No orders were needed. The fight was done, even if the war had not yet ended in their hearts. That evening, Dieter led the survivors through the shattered streets. They moved slowly, avoiding soldiers and looters alike. The city was no longer a battlefield, but a graveyard, blackened and still. At a crossroads, they paused. To the west lay Allied lines, to the east, Soviet occupation. Neither path promised safety, but they would choose, because choice, however slight, was all that remained. Dieter looked once over his shoulder at the ruins behind them, the schoolhouse, the bridge, the places where names had been spoken and silences shared. Then he turned forward and walked. They followed him, not because he had rank, but because he had walked this far with them. And that was enough. The war had ended. The struggle to live had just begun.